the world was on fire. And when all seemed lost, when the earth cracked and the volcanoes roared like wounded beasts, something appeared in the sky. A lone cloud during the day, a wandering star during the night. Signals coming from where? From whom? Today you will discover the legend of the Ant People, the underground guardians who saved humanity not once, but twice from the end of the world. Hello, I'm Kaya, Keeper of Legends. And today, I'm going to take you on a journey through the lost worlds of the Hopi, a story that speaks of total destruction, impossible refuge, and the hope that shines even when everything falls apart. This isn't just an ancient legend. It's a survival map that can speak directly to you. To understand this story, you need to know the people who have kept it for thousands of years. The Hopi have lived in the high deserts of Arizona for longer than we can imagine. To them, the word Hopi means peaceful people. And this peace didn't come from an easy life. It came from a deep understanding of something we, in the modern world, have completely forgotten. They know that this world is not the first, nor will it be the last. Hopi elders tell us that we once lived in 4 different worlds. The first was called Tokpela, the endless world. The second, Tokpa, the dark world. The third, Huskurza, a name that echoes like wind among the rocks. And now we are in the 4th world, Tuwakachi, the complete world. But every world before ours faced its destruction. And each time, the few who kept the faith, those who respected the Creator, were saved in ways that defy our comprehension. By whom? How? The answer is buried deep in the earth, literally. Imagine for a moment the first world, Tokpela. It was a time of abundance and harmony. People lived in tune with Tayoa, the Creator, and followed the instructions of Sotuknang, Tayoa's nephew, the one who shaped the 9 universes with his own hands. Sotuknang had created everything with a purpose. The mountains had their places. The rivers followed their sacred paths. And Spider-Woman had woven life into every corner of this world, creating the first human beings from red and yellow clay, breathing life into their nostrils. For a while, everything worked like a perfect symphony. People woke with the rising sun and gave thanks for the light. They planted with reverence, knowing that each seed was a gift. They shared what they had because they understood that everything came from the same sacred place. But human beings have a peculiar characteristic. They forget. Generation after generation, knowledge was diluted. Gratitude gave way to desire. Sharing gave way to greed. Instead of listening to the Creator's silent voice, people began to hear only the noise of their own desires. And Sotuknang watched, his heart heavy. He saw how people stopped singing sacred songs in the morning. He saw how they stopped offering their first harvests in gratitude. He saw how they began to fight over territories, to hoard more than they needed, to forget that they were all children of the same land. The first world was corrupting from within. The changes began subtly. A man who once shared his corn with a hungry neighbor now hoarded it all for himself, thinking, "What if it doesn't rain next season? I need to provide for my family first." A woman who taught sacred songs to children now devoted herself solely to her own children. Hunters stopped thanking the spirits of animals, and fishermen no longer spared the rivers. The harmony slowly broke, like clay dried under the sun. But not everyone forgot. Amidst the growing chaos, some still woke before dawn to give thanks. They still shared their food with the hungry. They still listened to the wind in the mountains as if it were the voice of a dear friend. These were the virtuous, those who remained faithful. Among them was a young man named Yaponcha. He lived in a small village atop a rocky mesa, where the wind blew cleanly and the rainwater collected in crystal-clear pools. Yaponcha still offered sacred tobacco at sunrise and whispered words of gratitude before each meal. and he started having strange dreams. Dreams where he saw giant ants walking through tunnels lit by crystals that pulsed like hearts. Dreams where he heard subterranean voices singing melodies his soul recognized, but his mind couldn't decipher. In his dreams, the ants looked at him with ancient, wise eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. "We are the guardians," they replied without moving their lips. "And the time will come when you will need us." Yaponcha would wake up with a racing heart and an inexplicable sense of urgency. He tried to tell others in the village, but most just shook their heads in pity. "They're just dreams, Yaponcha. You think too much about old stories." But there were others like him. Scattered throughout the first world, men and women who still maintained sacred practices also began to experience signs. Some dreamed of subterranean creatures. Others simply sensed that something great was coming. And it was to them that Sotuknang made a silent promise. Even if the whole world fell apart, he would find a way to save them. Time was running out. The cracks in the fabric of reality began small. Arguments that became conflicts. Conflicts that became wars. Wars that awakened something dormant deep within the earth. Animals were the first to notice. Birds flew in strange patterns, circling nervously before heading off in unknown directions. Horses were reluctant to drink from rivers, sniffing the water suspiciously. Dogs howled at the moon even when it wasn't in the sky. Yaponcha noticed that the ants around his house began behaving strangely. They carried their larvae to higher ground, building huge mounds overnight, as if they knew something terrible was coming from the depths. And then, on a morning that began like all the others, the first sign appeared. A solitary cloud, perfectly round, hovering in the blue sky. It didn't move with the wind, just remained there, as if waiting for something. Yaponcha left his house to fetch water and stopped halfway, staring at that impossible cloud. Other virtuosos around the world did the same. They stopped and looked up, feeling a shiver run down their spines, not of fear, but of recognition, as if an ancient part of their souls whispered, "Pay attention, something is coming." The cloud remained there for 3 days and 3 nights. During the day it was white as freshly picked cotton. At night it glowed with a soft, almost silvery light. On the 3rd day she started moving, slowly at first, as if testing whether anyone was following her, then steadily tracing her way toward the northern mountains. Yaponcha didn't hesitate. He gathered water, dry food, basic tools, and sacred seeds, which he kept in small leather bags. Other virtuous people around the world did the same, guided by an intuition that needed no explanation. They knew it was time to leave. Meanwhile, the rest of humanity went about its business, fighting over territories, accumulating wealth, and making plans for war. "It's just a cloud," they said. What could be so special about a cloud? But the virtuous knew it wasn't just a cloud. It was a call, an invitation, a last chance. And as they followed that celestial beacon, something began to happen in the world they were leaving behind. The first cracks appeared in the earth on a Tuesday morning. They began small, like thin lines traced by an invisible finger on the dry ground. Within hours, these lines turned into cracks, and the cracks into chasms that swallowed entire houses. The sound was the worst of all. A deep groan that came from the bowels of the earth, as if the planet itself were crying out in pain. A sound that made bones tremble and hearts race, even when one wasn't near the cracks. Yaponcha and other virtuosos, who had been following the guiding cloud for days, felt the sound vibrating through the ground. It was as if they were walking on the chest of a dying giant. "The world is dying," whispered an elderly woman beside him. Her name was Koyaanisqatsi, which in the Hopi language means life out of balance, a name that now seemed prophetic. Behind them, the sky began to change color. First a soft orange hue, then red as blood, and finally black as the darkest night, illuminated by an eerie light coming from below. The volcanoes were waking up. Mountains that had lain dormant for thousands of years roared to life, spewing rivers of lava that coursed through the earth like fiery serpents. The air grew thick with ash and the acrid smell of molten stone. Cities began to disappear. First, those near the volcanoes, swallowed by lava cascades that cascaded down from the mountains like deadly waterfalls. Then, even the most distant ones succumbed to the cracks, entire buildings being sucked into the depths as if the world were being drained. Yaponcha turned once to look back and saw on the horizon a column of fire rising from the earth to the sky, spinning like a tornado of flames. This was where his old village stood. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for those who didn't make it out in time. But the cloud continued northward, and the virtuous followed it. They walked by day under a sun that barely penetrated the smoke, and slept at night under a red sky reflecting the distant flames. Food was scarce, water was scarce, and children cried with exhaustion and fear. How much further, they asked each other. Where is this cloud taking us? No one had answers, only faith. The faith that Sotuknang wouldn't abandon them and that there was a purpose to this impossible journey. On the 7th day of walking, they reached the mountains. They were tall, like towers touching the clouds, made of dark stone with bluish reflections. And most importantly, they were cold. The infernal heat simply stopped at their base, as if there were an invisible line that fire couldn't cross. The guide cloud stopped over one of these mountains and began to circle slowly as if to say, "Here, climb up." But how? The slopes were steep, almost vertical. Exhausted with little food and small children, they seemed to have no strength. It was then that Yaponcha noticed something strange at the base of the mountain, a shadow that seemed to move regardless of the light. He came closer and discovered that it was not a shadow. It was an opening in the rock. The opening was small at first, just a dark crevice between two rocks, so narrow a person would have to squeeze through. But as Yaponcha explored with his hands, he realized the crevice widened inward, becoming a passage, and there was something else. A sound coming from inside the mountain. It wasn't the agonized groan of the dying earth they'd heard for days. It was something different. A low, almost musical hum, as if thousands of voices were singing a soft song far away. And there was a cool breeze coming from the opening, bringing the scent of wildflowers, clean water, and something that reminded her of cooking food. "Koyaniskatsi," Yaponcha called to the elderly woman. "You need to feel this." She leaned closer, inhaled deeply, and her eyes widened. "I know that smell," she whispered. "It's the smell of my dreams." Other virtuosos arrived, and all had the same reaction. Recognition. As if that place weren't strange, but familiar. A forgotten home their souls still held in their memories. The decision was unanimous. They would enter the mountain. Yaponcha was the first. The narrow passage seemed endless, but then it opened into a cavern that took his breath away. The high ceiling disappeared into darkness, lit only by crystals embedded in the walls, emitting a soft bluish light. Small figures moved with precision and grace. At first, Yaponcha thought they were children, but they were something else. Small, agile people with coordinated movements, reminiscent of intelligent ants that had learned to walk upright. "Welcome," a soft voice said in his mind. Not through his ears, but directly into his thoughts. It was one of the creatures, a little larger than the others, with eyes that glowed with their own light. "We are the Anu Sinom," he said, "the ant people. And this has been our home for much longer than you can imagine. Sotuknang told us that when the first world died, the virtuous would need a refuge. And we have prepared this place for you." Behind Yaponcha, the others began to enter, amazed. Koyaanisqatsi was the second to arrive. When she saw the ant people, she nearly fell, not from fear, but from profound recognition. "You're real," she whispered. "I've dreamed of you all my life." "And we dream of you," the leader replied, "because we all come from the same place. We are all children of the Creator." The opening was small at first, just a dark crevice between two rocks, so narrow a person would have to squeeze through. But as Yaponcha explored with his hands, he realized the crevice widened inward, becoming a passage. And there was something else, a sound coming from inside the mountain. It wasn't the agonized groan of the dying earth they'd heard for days. It was something different, a low, almost musical hum, as if thousands of voices were singing a soft song far away. And there was a cool breeze coming from the opening, bringing the scent of wildflowers, clean water, and something that reminded her of cooking food. "Koyaanisqatsi," Yaponcha called to the elderly woman. "You need to feel this." She leaned closer, inhaled deeply, and her eyes widened. "I know that smell," she whispered. "It's the smell of my dreams." Other virtuosos arrived, and all had the same reaction, recognition, as if that place weren't strange but familiar, a forgotten home their souls still held in their memories. The decision was unanimous. They would enter the mountain. Yaponcha was the first. The narrow passage seemed endless, but then it opened into a cavern that took his breath away. The high ceiling disappeared into darkness, lit only by crystals embedded in the walls, emitting a soft bluish light. Small figures moved with precision and grace. At first, Yaponcha thought they were children, but they were something else. Small, agile people with coordinated movements, reminiscent of intelligent ants that had learned to walk upright. "Welcome," a soft voice said in his mind. Not through his ears, but directly into his thoughts. It was one of the creatures, a little larger than the others, with eyes that glowed with their own light. "We are the Anusinom," he said, "the ant people, and this has been our home for much longer than you can imagine. Sotuknang told us that when the first world died, the virtuous would need refuge, and we have prepared this place for you." Behind Yaponcha, the others began to enter, amazed. Koyaanisqatsi was the second to arrive. When she saw the ant people, she nearly fell, not from fear, but from profound recognition. "You're real," she whispered. "I've dreamed of you all my life." "And we dream of you," the leader replied, "because we all come from the same place. We are all children of the Creator." What Yaponcha and the other virtuosos discovered in the depths of the mountain defied all comprehension. The ant people had built an entire city within the earth. Not just a cave, but a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and halls that stretched for miles in every direction. There were enormous rooms with vaulted ceilings where hundreds of people could comfortably gather. Smaller tunnels connected living areas, and special chambers stored food, water, and other supplies. And all of this was illuminated by the magical crystals that grew from the walls like flowers of light. "How did you do all this?" Yaponcha asked, as the ant people leader, who gave his name as Masawu, led him through the underground city. "We work," Masawu replied simply. "Like ants work. Each one does their part. No one works alone. And together we create something greater than anyone could imagine." It was true. Everywhere they looked, the virtuous saw the ant people working in harmony. Some expanded tunnels, others cultivated underground gardens in lighted chambers, and some cooked meals on stoves fueled by the earth's heat. No one gave orders, no one obeyed. Everyone simply knew what to do and did it. "How long have you lived here?" Koyaanisqatsi asked. "Since before the first world was created," Masawu replied. "We are guardians. When Sotuknang created the surface worlds, he placed us here to watch over what happened below, and to be ready when those above needed help. Massawu led them to a circular chamber in the heart of the city. In the center, a crystal-clear spring gushed from the living rock, surrounded by circles of polished stone. "This is the waiting chamber," he explained. "Here you can rest, eat, and wait for the purification to end." "How long will this last?" asked an 8-year-old girl, brave throughout the journey. "As long as it takes," Massawu replied tenderly. "The world above must burn to be reborn clean, like a forest that burns so that new trees can grow. And then? Then you will rise to the second world, a new world with new chances." The days that followed were like a dream. The ant people shared food grown in underground gardens, pure water from deep springs, and clothing made from special fibers grown in the most remote chambers. They also taught skills that humans on the surface had never developed: how to grow crops without sunlight, how to harness the earth's heat, and above all, how to live in complete harmony. There was no fighting, jealousy, or selfishness. When someone needed something, others appeared to help without needing to be asked. "How do you do that?" Yaponcha asked one evening, sitting near the fountain. "We remember," Massawu replied. "We never forget that we are all part of the same creation. When you understand this in your heart, it is impossible to hurt another being." Up above, the first world continued to die. Through special crystals, the refugees watched cities swallowed by lava and fissures, oceans boiling and evaporating. Terrible, but also beautiful, as if the earth were purifying itself for a new beginning. And then one morning the fire stopped. The volcanoes fell silent, the cracks ceased, and the red disappeared from the sky. The first world had completely died, and in the ashes of his death, something new began to be born. The silence was the first thing they noticed. For weeks, the sound of destruction echoed across the land, even in the depths where refugees waited. The roar of volcanoes, the groan of the earth cracking, the whistle of wind carrying ash across devastated landscapes. And suddenly, nothing. A silence so deep, it seemed to have its own weight. Massawu was the first to confirm this through observation crystals. "It's over," he said simply. "The first world has completed its journey." The virtuous gathered in the waiting chamber, a mixture of relief and sadness on their faces. Relief that they were safe. Sadness for all that had been lost up there. "What now?" asked Koyaanisqatsi. "Now Sotuknang will create the second world," Massawu replied. "But it takes time. The earth needs to cool. The ash needs to settle. New life needs to find a way to sprout." And so began a phase that no one had anticipated. They weren't just guests in the underground city, they were students. Massawu and other elders began teaching knowledge lost on the surface. How to live in harmony with one another, understand the language of nature, and work with the invisible energies that connected all living things. Yaponcha discovered that his dreams about ants were no coincidence. The ant people had been communicating with the virtuous on the surface for years, silently preparing them for what was to come. "You called to us in your dreams," Massawu explained. "We answered, planting seeds of knowledge that would blossom in due time." The children learned faster. The girl who asked about the weather showed a talent for growing crystals. Others learned to cultivate underground plants, weave special fibers, and channel the earth's heat. But the most important lesson wasn't practical. It was about memory. "You will return to the surface," Massawu said, "and when you return, you will repopulate the world. If your descendants forget the lessons of the first world, the second will also be purified." "And then?" asked a young man. "Then you come back down. We'll be waiting here." The idea was both comforting and burdensome. The ant people were eternal guardians, ready to save the faithful few whenever the world fell apart. Months passed. Through the crystals, they watched the second world take shape. First, gentle rains washed away the ashes of the old world. Then green shoots emerged from the fertile soil. Rivers once again flowed through valleys once burned to dust. The world was different from the first. Mountains and rivers had new shapes. Everything seemed fresh, alive, full of possibilities. Then Sotoknang spoke to Masawu through a special crystal. "It's time," he announced. "The second world is ready to receive you." The climb was very different from the desperate descent of months before. The tunnels were wide and bright. They carried with them not only belongings, but something far more precious: knowledge. Knowledge on how to build lasting communities, resolve conflicts without violence, and always remember your origins. When they emerged, the air was sweet and clean. The sky blue as a precious stone. And for the first time in months, they felt the gentle warmth of the sun on their faces. The second world awaited them. The second world, Tokpa, was a wonder that surpassed the refugees' most ambitious dreams. Where once there were scorched deserts, now stretched green prairies waving in the wind like an ocean of grass. Where once there were lava-shattered mountains, now rose majestic snow-crowned peaks that glittered like diamonds in the sun. And there was life everywhere. Animals they had never seen before grazed peacefully on the plains. Birds with impossibly colored plumage built nests in towering trees. Silvery fish leaped in rivers so crystal clear that the bottom could be seen even in the deepest parts. "It's as if Sotuknang had painted the whole world again," whispered Yapongcha, now older but still capable of childlike wonder. The virtuous spread across the second world and began to build a new civilization, this time in a different way. They remembered the lessons of the ant people. They created communities where everyone had a voice, shared resources, and taught children not only practical skills, but also the sacred stories that explained humanity's origins and place in the world. For generations, it worked perfectly. Villages flourished. People lived long and full lives. There was art, music, and festivals that celebrated the beauty of life and the eternal cycle of birth and renewal. Yaponcha lived to see his great-grandchildren play in the fields where he had planted the first seeds. When he set out to join his ancestors, he knew he had fulfilled his mission, to preserve not only life, but the wisdom that made it worth living. But as Masawu had warned, humans have a tendency to forget. Not immediately, not in a generation or two, but slowly, like sand slipping through your fingers. Early generations told the stories of the ant people with reverence. But over time, they began to sound too far-fetched to be real. "Do ant people exist?" the young people asked. "Or did our ancestors create these stories to teach lessons?" Some elders insisted they were true. Others said only the teachings mattered, not the details. And so sacred practices were seen as optional. "Of course we should be thankful," they said. "But do we really need to wake up before dawn every day? We can be thankful whenever we can. Of course we must share with those in need, but first we must provide for our own family." The cracks in the harmony started small but grew quickly. Once united villages began to fight over hunting grounds. Groups formed military alliances. People began to divide into us and them. Amidst all this, few remained faithful. Among them was Ayana, the great-granddaughter of a child rescued from the first refuge. She had grown up hearing stories of the ant people from her great-grandmother, one of the last who still remembered the underground city. Ayana followed the ancient teachings with devotion. She woke early to give thanks, shared her food with the hungry, and resolved conflicts with patience and compassion. Then the dreams began. The same dreams Yaponcha had had in the first world. Wise ants in crystal-lit tunnels, voices whispering, "We are here. We have always been here." At first he thought they were echoes of the stories, but the dreams grew stronger and more urgent. He soon noticed the signs. The animals began to behave strangely, not as before when they fled from danger, but as if they were being guided. Everyone, birds, deer, even fish, moved south in a silent march. And it was getting cold. It wasn't the normal winter cold that comes and goes. It was a constant cold, growing day by day, as if something was sucking the warmth out of the world. Ayana tried to warn her village, but no one paid attention. "It's just weather changes," they said. "You see patterns where there aren't any." But one frosty morning, she looked up at the sky and saw a star shining where none should be during the day. And in that instant, I knew the truth. The second world was coming to an end. The star in the daytime sky was not like the cloud that had guided the refugees from the first world. It was smaller, more intense, pulsing with a light that seemed to cut through the growing haze that was covering the sky. And she moved, not with the majestic speed of the guiding cloud, but with urgency, as if time were running out too quickly. Ayana gathered her most essential things, just as her ancestors had done generations before: sacred seeds, some water, dried food, and a small smooth stone her great-grandmother had given her on her deathbed. "This stone came from the underground city," the old woman had whispered. "If the dark times return, it will warm in your hand when you are near the refuge." Ayana had never fully believed the story, but now, with the stone in her pocket gently pulsing as she followed the guiding star, she began to understand that some truths were too great for human comprehension. Other virtuosos around the second world were making the same journey. Not many, unfortunately. Most were so absorbed in their disputes and ambitions that they failed to see the obvious signs that the world was ending. The cold intensified dramatically with each passing day. Rivers that had never frozen over began to form thick ice at their edges. Plants that had flourished year-round withered and died. The air itself seemed to grow thinner, harder to breathe. And then it started to snow. Not the gentle, seasonal snow people were familiar with, but a relentless snowfall that fell day and night without stopping. Huge flakes accumulated until they covered entire houses. Behind the virtuous few, entire villages disappeared under blankets of white. Families burned furniture for warmth, eating their last food reserves, not knowing when the storm would end. Many did not survive. Escape through the storm was even more challenging than in the first burning world. The cold was treacherous. It seeped through any clothing, froze the moisture in the body, and numbed fingers and feet until they became dangerously numb. And even more dangerous was the way it affected the mind. As temperatures dropped, people thought more slowly. It was tempting to lie down in the snow and rest. Just a few minutes. Ayana saw several people succumb to this temptation. They would wander away from the group and never return. Their bodies would be found hours later, eerily peaceful under the fresh snow. "Don't stop," she would shout when she saw someone hesitate. "No matter how much it hurts, don't stop moving." Their guiding star led them on a different route than the first. This time, they headed east, climbing ever steeper slopes as the snow grew deeper and the cold more brutal. Ayana began to wonder if this time would be different. Perhaps the ant people had disappeared or decided that humanity wasn't worth saving again. Then the stone in his pocket became so hot that it almost burned his skin. She stopped abruptly. All around her was snow and wind. The storm was so intense that she could barely see the other refugees. Guided by the heat of the stone, Ayana trudged toward a rock formation barely visible in the blizzard. There, protected by the rocks and almost hidden by the accumulated snow, was a familiar opening. The entrance to the ant people's second refuge was different from the first. Larger, more elaborate, as if they'd had time to prepare better this time. crystals of blue light marked the path downward, pulsing in sequence as if guiding the refugees to safety. The air rising from the tunnels was warm, carrying the familiar scent of food and wildflowers. Ayana was the first to descend, followed by the few virtuous who had managed the journey through the icy storm. There were even fewer than the first time, perhaps 50 people in total, including some children who survived the brutal cold. The underground city had grown greatly since the first destruction of the world. New tunnels extended in previously non-existent directions. Larger chambers were excavated, and there were more ant people now, as if they too had thrived during the peaceful centuries of the Second World. Massawu was there to greet them, showing no signs of aging since the first refugees had left to repopulate the surface. "Welcome back," he said, a mixture of joy and sadness in his telepathic voice. Joy at seeing them safe. Sadness because it meant humanity had failed again. "We failed," Ayana said, echoing everyone's thoughts. "Our ancestors learned, but we forgot." "You have not failed," Massawu replied. "You are here because you remembered enough to see the signs and follow the guiding star. The flame of wisdom has not gone out." The ant people generously welcomed the refugees. Heated rooms, hot food, and dry clothing were provided to replace the freezing garments of the journey. And once again, the waiting period became a time of learning, but this time the lessons were different. The ant people had seen how, in the Second World, truths were slowly diluted and forgotten. "Knowledge is not enough," Massawu explained. "This time, you need to bring something deeper." "What could be deeper than knowledge?" Ayana asked. "Direct experience," he replied. "Real connection with the forces that create and sustain the worlds. Not just knowing about Sotuknang and Spider-Woman, but feeling them through you." The following months were intense. The ant people guided them in practices that expanded their consciousness beyond human limits. Telepathic communication, perception of invisible energies, and glimpses of the past and future. Most importantly, they learned to connect directly with Sotuknang and Spider-Woman, feeling their presence as living, loving forces. Ayana demonstrated a special talent. He could not only communicate telepathically, but also sense people's intentions and needs without them speaking. "You will be a leader in the Third World," Massawu said, "but a leader who leads by example and wisdom, not by authority." "What if I forget? Then you will descend again, and we will be here waiting. But this time, you will take away real experience of the sacred. That is much harder to forget." Above, the Second World was slowly dying under an ice age. Through the crystals, they could see ice-covered landscapes stretching for miles in every direction. It was beautiful and terrible. Buildings were preserved like frozen museums, but there was no movement, no life, only the silent white of death. And then, as gradually as it had begun, the cold began to subside. The thawing of the Second World was a spectacle none of the underground refugees would ever forget. Through the ant people's observation crystals, they watched massive glaciers crack with thunderous sounds that echoed for hundreds of miles. They saw rivers of meltwater gush from the frozen landscape, creating temporary waterfalls that cascaded down icy cliffs. And as the ice receded, it revealed a land transformed once again. The Third World, Cuscursa, was different from both the first and the second. Climate change had created deep canyons where plains once stood. Mountains were carved into fantastic shapes by the movement of glaciers. Huge lakes formed in depressions left by the weight of the ice. It was a more dramatic and wild world, but full of possibilities. "It's time," Massawu announced, after months of watching the land stabilize on the surface. This time, the ant people's farewell was more emotional. The refugees had spent more time underground, forming deeper bonds with their rescuers. and they carried the responsibility of knowing that this might not be the last time they sought refuge. Remember, Masao said as he led them through the tunnels, you carry the memory of all the worlds that came before. You are the living library of human experience. Ayana, now recognized as a spiritual leader, also carried telepathic connections to the ant people. If you need us again, Masao said in his final farewell, you will know what to call us. The connection between our peoples is now permanent. The third world welcomed refugees with a different abundance than they had known. This was a world of contrasts. Deserts stretched for hundreds of miles, punctuated by stunning oases. Forests so dense that little sunlight reached the ground, teeming with animals that seemed to have come from dreams. Deep blue oceans scattered with islands like jewels. The refugees spread across this new land and began to build a civilization in a radically different way. Instead of centralized villages, they created a network of communities connected by sacred trails. Each had its own specialty: healing, astronomy, arts. And in all of them, the teachings of the ant people were preserved as living practices. Children grew up learning to communicate telepathically. They learned to sense the needs of animals and plants, to perceive the invisible currents of energy that connected all living things. For many generations, this worked magnificently. The third world prospered in an unprecedented way. There were no wars, as any conflict was resolved through telepathic communication, revealing each person's needs and fears. There was no scarcity, as communities shared resources freely. There was no environmental destruction, as everyone felt the impact of their actions on nature. Ayana lived to see her descendants thrive in harmony. When she left, she knew she had helped create something lasting. But time brought changes. The telepathic abilities that maintained this balance began to create an unexpected problem. Some people became addicted to the power these abilities provided. It started innocently enough. Talented individuals used their skills to influence others' decisions, believing they were helping. I'm just telling the truth, they said. Others manipulated natural energies for their own benefit, making crops grow faster or attracting animals. I'm just in harmony with nature, they justified. Some used their insights to predict and influence future events, accumulating wealth and power. I'm just using the gifts I've been given, they rationalized. Over time, the small manipulations escalated. What began as altruistic acts escalated into control and greed, and slowly, the third world began to fragment, just like the previous ones. But this time, the divisions were subtle and dangerous, disguised as spirituality and wisdom. Block 12. The corruption of spiritual power. What happened in the third world was perhaps the most subtle and therefore the most dangerous of all the corruptions that humanity had ever experienced. In previous worlds, selfishness was obvious. People openly fighting over resources, wars declared over territory, greed visible and identifiable. But in the third world, corruption has disguised itself as enlightenment. A class of people emerged who considered themselves more evolved than the rest of humanity. They had developed their telepathic and energy manipulating abilities to extraordinary levels. They could influence the weather, control plant growth, and even affect other people's thoughts and emotions. And they began to believe that these powers gave them the right to rule. We see further, they said. We understand the connections that others cannot perceive. Isn't it our responsibility to guide those who are still blind? They formed secret councils, making decisions that affected entire communities without consulting those affected. They justified their actions by claiming that the masses lacked sufficient knowledge to understand the complexities involved. They created rituals that looked like spiritual ceremonies, but were actually sophisticated forms of mind control. they convinced groups that certain actions were spiritually necessary, when in reality they only served to concentrate power. And the most dangerous thing, they sincerely believed they were doing good. This conviction has made corruption nearly impossible to detect and combat. How can you argue against someone who is genuinely convinced their motives are pure? How can you resist the influence of someone who can read minds and manipulate emotions? Among the few who noticed was Palatquapi, a direct descendant of Ayana. He had inherited her telepathic abilities, but also her wisdom and humility. Palatquapi noted that spiritual directives always favored the counselors. Necessary rituals concentrated more power in a few. Revealed truths justified exactly what the leaders wanted to do. He tried to warn others, but it was almost impossible. Some did not believe that such spiritually advanced people could act corruptly. Others, already under the influence, rejected any contrary idea as if their minds had been programmed. When he tried to confront the council members directly, they confused his thinking, making him doubt himself. "You are projecting your shadows onto us," they said gently. "You see corruption where there is only love and wisdom. Perhaps you need more spiritual purification." In desperation, Palatquapi remembered the ancient teachings of the ant people, guardians ever ready to help those who remained faithful. He set off alone into the desert, attempting something no one had done for generations, establishing direct contact with them. At first, nothing happened. Palatquapi meditated for hours, trying to reach with his mind the depths of the earth where he knew they lived. Just as he was about to give up, a voice whispered in his mind. "We're here," Masawu said. "We've always been here, and we see what's happening." "Can you help us?" Palatquapi asked, distressed. "This time it's different. It's not just greed or violence, it's something more subtle, more dangerous." "Yes," Masawu replied, sadness in his telepathic voice. "It is the corruption of spiritual power itself, the most dangerous of all, because it disguises itself as light. What can we do?" "The same we've always done. Save those who remain faithful. But this time it will be different. The signs will be different, and the refuge will be different too." Palatquapi shuddered. "Different how?" "You will see. First find the other virtuous ones. They are scattered, hidden, but they exist. When the signs come, you will need to be ready." The connection fell apart, leaving Palatquapi alone under the desert stars. But now he had hope and a mission. Finding the true virtuosos in the third world proved to be a more complex task than Palatquapi had imagined. Unlike previous worlds, where the line between good and evil was relatively clear, the third world had become a labyrinth of moral subtleties. Many people who appeared virtuous on the surface were actually deeply under the influence of corrupt councils. And some people who seemed indifferent to spiritual matters were actually those who held true integrity in their hearts. Palatquapi traveled undercover as a wandering merchant, visiting communities scattered throughout the third world. In each place, he silently observed how people interacted when they thought no one important was looking. The truly virtuous were those who treated animals kindly without witnesses, who shared food with strangers without seeking recognition, and who resolved conflicts with genuine compassion without subtle telepathic manipulation. Most importantly, they were those who questioned the teachings of the councils, even when it put them at risk. Among those he encountered was Talavai, an elderly woman living alone in a mountain hut. She had been expelled for refusing to participate in purification rituals, which were actually mental conditioning sessions. "I could feel something was wrong," he explained. "When they performed their rituals, it was like something was trying to rearrange my thoughts. It didn't feel sacred, it felt invasive." Palatquapi also found young artists hiding in caves, creating works that celebrated true spirituality rather than the distorted version promoted by the councils. There were also farmers who continued to treat the land with ancient reverence, refusing to use energy manipulation techniques that would yield larger harvests but unbalance nature. "We're not against progress," said Koyawema, one of those farmers. "But there's a difference between working with nature and forcing it to obey our will. The councils have forgotten that." Over time, Palatquapi established a discreet network among these virtuosos. Not a formal organization that could be infiltrated, but a web based on mutual trust and shared values. And it was just in time, because the signs started to appear. The first signs of the end of the Third World were neither fire nor ice, but water. Torrential rains began to fall. Rivers overflowed and lakes swelled, swallowing fertile land. And even stranger, springs began to spring up in places where they had never existed before, as if the earth itself were weeping. The councils tried to use this to their advantage. "See," they proclaimed, "the abundance of water proves that our methods are working. The earth responds to our spiritual wisdom." They performed ceremonies to channel the water, but in reality they were diverting the floods away from their privileged lands, sacrificing communities that opposed them. For a while it seemed to work, but natural forces were far greater than any human manipulation. When the councils tried to impose their will, nature reacted with fury. Rains became hurricanes, rivers turned into destructive torrents, and springs erupted like geysers, felling enormous trees. It was then that the sign Palatquapi had been waiting for came. It wasn't a cloud or a star, but a spiral rainbow, appearing during a storm when there should have been no sunlight. Its colors were intense, and instead of forming an arch, it descended from the sky like a colorful staircase. The rainbow remained for 3 days and slowly began to move westward towards the great ocean. Palatquapi spread the message across the network. It was time to leave. The journey this time was chaotic. A region could be dry in the morning and submerged in the afternoon. Rivers changed course overnight, forming sudden lakes. Storms came and went without warning. The councils, realizing people were fleeing, sent search parties to rescue those who followed the signs. They used their telepathic abilities to convince the virtuous to return. When this failed, they resorted to force. "You are being deceived by false visions," they said. "We can control the floods. Come back and trust us." But the virtuous already knew how to distinguish manipulation from true guidance. They continued to follow the rainbow, facing dangers both natural and human. After weeks of traveling through ever-changing lands, they finally reached the West Coast. What the virtuosos found on the West Coast defied all their expectations based on previous refuges. There were no mountains with hidden entrances to underground cities. Instead, there was something that seemed impossible, a floating island in the water, made of a material that glowed softly with its own light. The island was not large, perhaps a few hundred meters in diameter, but it was perfectly circular and seemed to be anchored by invisible currents that reached down into the depths of the ocean, and there were figures moving across the surface of the island. Figures that looked familiar, even from a distance. "The ant people," Talavai whispered, recognizing them through his expanded perception. "But how did they get here? How did they build this?" The answer came when the first of the ant people approached the shore, in a vessel made of the same luminous material as the island. It was Masauwu, seemingly unchanged as ever, but there was something different about him this time. A deeper seriousness, a sadness that hadn't been present in their previous encounters. "Welcome," he said as he helped the first virtuosos onto the boat. "But I must warn you, this refuge will be different from the others." "Different how?" asked Palatquapi. "The other refuges were temporary," Masauwu explained as the vessel moved smoothly through the water. "You descended, waited for the purification to complete, and then ascended to repopulate a renewed world. But this time, He paused, choosing his words carefully. This time, the damage was deeper. The corruption of spiritual power has wounded the very essence of this world in a way that cannot be healed with fire, ice, or water. The third world cannot be renewed. It must be replaced. The virtuous processed in silence. Masawu's words brought the certainty that there would be no return to the world they knew. The floating island turned out to be even more impressive up close. It was constructed of a material that appeared to be a fusion of living crystal and organic metal. The structures grew from the very substance of the island, as if they had been cultivated rather than built. And it wasn't just the ant people who lived there. There were other creatures, beings the virtuous had never seen before. Some seemed made of crystallized light, others of jellyfish maintaining humanoid form by sheer will, and others seemed composed of sentient air. Who are they? Palatquapi asked in wonder. They are guardians of the other elements, Masawu explained. Just as we guard the earth, they guard fire, water, and air. Together we preserve the essence of life when the physical worlds can no longer sustain it. The island was not just a refuge, it was a complete world in miniature. There were gardens with plants that existed nowhere on the surface, laboratories where guardians worked with energies beyond human comprehension, and libraries that contained crystallized memories of every world that had ever existed. In the center of the island, a special chamber housed a golden light that pulsed gently like a giant heart of pure energy. "What is this?" asked a virtuous child. "It is the seed of the next world," a firekeeper replied, his voice like wood crackling in a fireplace. "Within this light are all the possibilities of what may come to be." "And we're going to help plant it?" asked the girl. "You will do more than that," Masawu replied. "You will become part of it." The following months were filled with preparation like never before. Instead of simply learning to preserve knowledge, the virtuous learned to merge with the creative forces of the universe. Each guardian worked to expand their consciousness. They learned to exist as individuals and as part of a greater whole, maintaining their identities while connecting to the collective consciousness that was gestating the fourth world. They wouldn't just populate the next world. They would literally help create it, molding their essences into the spiritual foundation upon which it would be built. Meanwhile, the third world continued its self-destruction. Through the observation crystals, they saw entire continents disappearing beneath the waters. The remaining lands were fought over by survivors in desperate battles. The corrupt councils had lost all control. Their rituals now accelerated chaos. Their abilities were used in brutal mind wars between rival factions. It was terrible to watch, but also inevitable, as if the world were being cleansed of centuries of corruption. And then the final moment arrived. The final transformation of the third world was not gradual like the previous destructions. It was instantaneous, absolute, and startlingly beautiful. One morning that had begun like all others on the floating island, the golden light at its center began to pulse with increasing intensity. The elemental guardians gathered around it, and the virtuous felt an irresistible call to join. "It's time," Masawu announced, his telepathic voice filled with solemnity and joy. "The seed is ready to germinate." What happened next defied description in human words. The golden light expanded to encompass the entire island, descending into the waters and rising into the sky. As it touched the turbulent waters of the dying third world, they instantly transformed into pure light. And as the light spread, it did not destroy, it created. Where there were chaotic waters, fertile lands emerged, organized into patterns of impossible beauty. Where there were destructive storms, blue skies appeared with clouds that seemed painted by a divine artist. Where there was desolation and conflict, abundance and harmony arose. The virtuous discovered that as the light touched them, They too were being transformed. Their bodies became more resilient, adapted to the new world that was emerging. Their minds expanded to include not only their own perspectives, but also an abiding connection to the collective wisdom of all the guardians and previous worlds. And most importantly, their hearts were filled with an unconditional love that made any thought of selfishness or corruption impossible. They had become the first truly purified inhabitants of the fourth world. As the transformation spread, it touched not only physical matter, but also the consciousness of all living beings. Plants, animals, and even the elements gained a level of consciousness and cooperation never before seen. The fourth world, Tuakachi, emerged as a perfect synthesis of all that had been learned in the previous worlds. There was the physical abundance of the first world, but without the greed that corrupted it. The artistic beauty of the second world, without the arrogance that led to freezing. And the spiritual abilities of the third, without the possibility of corruption, for everyone maintained a connection to the source of all wisdom. The ant people and other guardians have established a permanent presence in the fourth world, not as hidden saviors, but as visible advisors, always available for guidance. There will be no need for more refuges, Masao Wu explained. Connection to sacred wisdom is now part of the very fabric of reality. Decades passed, and the fourth world flourished beyond the wildest dreams. Cities were built as works of art integrated into natural ecosystems. Technologies were developed in cooperation with the forces of nature, never in opposition to them. Humanity has learned to live not only in harmony with one another, but as a conscious part of the greater symphony of existence. Palatquapi, now far beyond normal human age, but kept youthful by the energies of the fourth world, sometimes sat in the hills at sunset, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. He remembered the fear and despair in the third world when he first sensed the subtle corruption spreading. He remembered the loneliness of being one of the few to see through the illusions that hypnotized everyone. And he marveled at how the end turned out to be just another beginning in an endless journey of growth. But perhaps the most significant transformation was not in the external world, but in humanity itself. The inhabitants of the fourth world could no longer forget their sacred origins, for this memory was now part of their very nature. They carried the living memory of all the worlds, all the lessons learned and mistakes that would never need to be repeated. And they carried something more, eternal gratitude for the ant people and guardians who made this transformation possible. On clear nights when the stars shone like diamonds, people looked up and whispered words of thanks. And in the crystalline cities, visible through portals in the earth, the ant people heard these words and smiled with the satisfaction of a mission finally accomplished. If this journey through the Hopi worlds touched something deeper within you, if you recognized in your own life moments when it seemed like your world was ending but you found signs to move forward, I want to invite you to learn about the Forgotten Agreement, the 30-day challenge. This book can be your own underground refuge, the place where you find the tools and wisdom to not only survive life's storms, but emerge from them transformed and strengthened. There's a special chapter dedicated to recognizing the invisible signs that appear in our lives exactly when we need them most, the clouds and stars of our own spiritual paths. Head over to the first comment. Your transformation journey can begin today. How many times in life do we feel like our world is ending? A relationship that ends and leaves us lost. A job that disappears and questions our identity. A dream that shatters and makes us doubt our purpose. In these moments, everything seems like fire, ice, or flood. Destruction seems total. Fear tightens the chest and whispers that this time there is no way out. But the legend of the ant people teaches us a profound truth. Even in the most complete destruction, even when everything we know crumbles, there are always unseen guardians waiting to guide us. Sometimes there are people who show up at just the right moment, with exactly the words we need to hear. Sometimes there are opportunities that arise out of nowhere when we thought all doors were closed. Sometimes they're just intuitions, inner impulses that move us in the right direction, even when we don't understand where we're going. The Hopi call these sacred signs. I call them hope in action. Because hope, I discovered, is not just a passive feeling. It is an active force in the universe, always bridging chasms that seemed insurmountable, always opening portals to possibilities we never knew existed. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of all. No matter how many times our personal worlds need to be destroyed and recreated, no matter how many transformations we have to go through, there is always a refuge for those who keep the faith. There are always guardians waiting in the depths, ready to welcome us, teach us, and prepare us for the next world that is always being born. The journey truly never ends. It just transforms. And with each transformation, we become wiser, more resilient, better able to recognize the signs that guide us home. If this legend spoke directly to your heart, if it touched memories of your own refuges and transformations, I reinforce my invitation. And if you want to continue hearing stories like this, legends that awaken the ancient wisdom that lives within you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. So we continue together on this journey of discovery, learning from the signs, even on days when the world seems to be falling apart. Until the next legend, keep your eyes on the sky and your heart open to the signs. They are always there, waiting for those brave enough to follow them.